hearing you talk, I think about Jerry and Howard, and then thinking about the other people that are in the picture. There's Dan earlier, and they overlap slightly, but it's kind of more of a handoff. There's you, obviously, and then there are lots of other crew members that go unnamed, but are also present on the job as well. And it really struck me as it is such an interesting. I don't know. In classes, people abhor group work, right? Like group projects are the worst because I always end up carrying the burden or whoever, there's the different dynamics. And I'm struck by the number of
That's the way
fields
work gets done, man.
that require group work that
Absolutely.
I think, don't think about. Whether you're talking about a film, you label the director and maybe you credit an actor, but there's the cast and crew is huge.
Sure.
Again, strikes right now.
Sure.
And then, even comic books, have a writer and an illustrator and a penciler and an inker
and they're all meeting at various points along the way to share what they've come up with at that point and see if they're all working on the same quote page unquote. So no, that's the way work gets done. And I've always pushed against. I know what you're saying about kids hating the group work. I always push back. I always push back and say, you're going to find yourself in a pod very much like the kind of pod I'm going to be putting you in here, and you're going to have to cooperate. You're going to have to collaborate. You're going to have to suppress your ego a little bit, or at least find a place to put it while you're working with these other people. And yeah, the group thing matters a lot to me. And of course, Howard made that point too. When he was talking to me about bottlenecks and all of these trades work, and it's kind of a ballet. You've got one group coming in here and doing the concrete work, and then you get somebody coming in and do the framing, and then you got steel workers coming in, you got the plumbers, on and on and on, and they all have to be timed. They have to be working according to a schedule, or it gets all screwed up. So I don't know. Well, I guess I do understand why students have a lot of trouble with group work, or even to the point of sharing credit for the work that they're doing. No, it's my work. No, because that's the way things work in high school a lot. It's my work. I did it. Don't look over my shoulder. It's. I think that's changing, but not quickly enough, unfortunately.
I think in the case of Howard and building Kevin, it just really struck me how, like, he is, despite the ability in the instance you give where he fires everybody, that's not a privilege he typically has. You are often at the whim and mercy of whoever is around. And so, great. Howard's great at finishing, and he can certainly do the building and the framing and all those things also, but his love is the finishing work, the detail.
It is.
But to get to that point, you need to build the structure, you need the plumbing, you need the electrical, you need all of these other things that maybe he could do, but it's not necessarily his passion or that he's the most gifted at. And so, like, especially when you take something to the South Shore and you are removed from a lot of the big city availability of some of those services, then your choices are even fewer. So you have to put ego aside somehow to get along with people. And I would love to know more about the cast and crew who, essentially built the cabin. Like, what was that like, Jerry aside? That sounds like they butted heads.
Well, it was pretty straightforward given the fact that the crew was small. I mean, it was Jerry, and once the amateurs took off to go back to school or whatever they were doing, it was Jerry and Howard and me, and Chris, and then Chris went back to school. So it was basically the three of us. Where things got complicated were when we had to make room for interruptions by other people who were coming in. The plumber, Mr. Blakeman, came in, and he had to dig a couple of huge holes for the holding tanks, and he had to put the plastic pipe in that led back to the house, and then of course he had to rework that space that we had constructed as a bathroom space, to put in the one-piece shower and toilet and little sink and stuff like that. And we may have gotten ahead of ourselves a little bit, although Howard never said a word about it. We brought in a tile man to do the kitchen, and working around to the entryway and then into the bathroom itself. We got that all set. So various trades were coming in, and in order to facilitate one of the processes of the job, and Dan was still there for this. Yeah, Dan was still there for this. The most important part of the job required the greatest number of people, and that was, once that window wall of 18 feet at a 14-degree angle was built, and Howard had shot zillions of nails into that wall to stabilize it against racking. There was the process of having to have, and this happened periodically through the job, but for this particular part of the job, it was really important. The delivery of those 35-foot, 35-foot laminated beams, and Howard, was confronted with, first of all, how do we get those up into that window opening? The roof was all framed, and there's this fairly large opening for a window at the rear of the building, and there's that beautiful bird's mouth above the window, quite a bit above the window, and in the front of the building, which I label as pointing towards the lake, another bird's mouth, 18 plus feet high, same in the back. How do we get those beams in place? And so Howard and Dan were primarily responsible for building the catwalk. That it wasn't enough to just have the scaffolding. We needed a catwalk that went from front to back, and so they constructed that. We were able to build a lot of it in place on top of scaffolding, and then the issue was, how are we going to get these glue lamps through this window space and not do a heck of a lot of damage? And that's where the whole notion of master carpenter comes into play. It's not just knowing how to use the tools and to be able to measure and build things plumb, level, and square, and follow proper building principles. There's a notion of the creative imagination, being able to create your own tools, or even medieval machines, to be able to get the job done. And that's what Howard did. He built what he called a Trojan horse. that once a pole truck was on site, which Howard arranged um, from uh, the sawmill just located up the street from where he lived, um, and uh, driven by a close friend of his, and sometimes a worker on some of his jobs. To get that on site, the glue lamps are on site. Everything is delivered just right in sequence, and then each one of those beams is hoisted up through that window. We're up there, Chris and me and Dan, um, and Howard is down below managing um, one end of those glue lamps, and 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 Dan is instructing us how to move those glue lamps all the way to the front of the building. And then when the four of them are up there, we've got to use these huge bolts. We got to bore through them, and then we have to use these huge bolts to put them um, together. And that's going to be that's the basis of the structure of the building. And that was the thing that gave Howard the greatest amount of trouble, and that required the greatest number of people to contribute in their way to um, making that happen. And yeah, it came off beautifully, um, but we couldn't have done it really without um, two really skilled carpenters, Dan and Howard, um, putting that catwalk together. I still have that catwalk out there. It's a bunch of flaps that I used to walk down to the gazebo that I built a number of years ago. Um, and everything worked beautifully to make that happen, and it solved the problem. And I think, in looking back on it, I think this might have been one of the reasons why Howard asked for the sabbatical. He, I don't think he knew at that point um, how he was going to solve that problem of racking and and hanging the entire building on what seemed like a skyhook at that point. When he came back, he knew. He knew. Um, and he thought it all through. Um, but yeah, I mean, think of the number of craftsmen and tradesmen that Howard knew. Just as a sidebar, um, once those glue lamps were in place, and uh, the the window wall was secured, we needed to get those windows in. You know how big those windows are. I had borrowed some scaffolding from the Bayfield Pirates, who'd screwed up the crawl space so badly I would not give them back their materials until I was able to use them as the foundation for putting up those windows. So Howard brought over about, I don't know, 6 or 8 guys, a whole bunch of people that he brought over. And yep, one at a time, you know, 6, 4, 2, we got them all in there. And it was a precarious task because they had to, the reason we had to have 6 or 8 was because they were so heavy. They had to be handed up to us, and we had to put them in place, and then we had to use our guns to nail those things in place. Um, yeah, that required a great deal of cooperation from people who um, were skilled at this sort of thing or not, just happened to be around. You know what I mean? So yeah,
I'm really struck by how, in so many ways, like Howard acts as a conductor,
Mm.
like for this big orchestra, big or small, right? It grows and shrinks
Oh
as
yeah,
needed.
yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, like, and I don't know classical music well enough to make this analogy, so it may be unfair, but Howard knows each of the instruments and what they should look like afterwards.
Hmm.
Like he knows that the plumbing is poorly done, or if the electrical is run in a way that is a problem.
Yeah,
He's more than project manager. You've caught him at the end of his career, and like part of me wonders, like,
yeah,
would he have taken this on earlier in his career, and how would that process have looked like compared to the Howard that you got doing this and thoughtfully going like, man, I need some time to figure this out. you know?
yeah. I truly believe him when he said, I'm taking on this job because it's interesting. I don't think I've ever encountered anything quite like it before. I believe him when he said that. And this from a guy, had been working for 50 years at his craft, pretty much seen it all, done it all. Um, and there were wrinkles in this particular job that caused him to say, no, I'm not quite done with outside work. I want to do this. I want to do this. And part of it was the creative element, I think, in him. But I'm, I'm not sure that he would have done something like this early in his career. One of the things that struck me about his early career was he was busy pounding out tract houses as fast as he could punch them out. He learned his lesson trying to sell them on spec. That didn't work out for him. But during the building boom after the war, um, that's what he was doing. There weren't a lot of nuances to the houses that he was building. Um, the real nuances that he got into had to do with the fine furniture that he built and the research that he had to do in order to build it. Um, but um, I'm still struck by the fact that as busy as he was then, and as tired as he was of a dangerous work outside, he made an exception. He didn't know us, you know. Um, he wanted to take it on because there was a challenge there for him, and there was a problem to solve. I don't think he would have done that early in his career.